and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books out loud. This is a Little Blue Book. It is Little Blue Book 1723, and it is titled The Amazing Career of Al Capone, and it is written by Leah Gregg. There is no copyright date, but as always, it's probably written in the 1920s. Alrighty, let's get started. Pardon me. The Amazing Career of Al Capone, Chapter 1. The telephone in Big Jim Colosimo's private office jingled. He answered it. "This is little Jimmy. I just want to let you know I'm gonna kill you," came the voice over the wire. That was all. There was the click of the receiver in Big Jim's ear, and he knew that little Jimmy Cosmano wasn't jesting. Colosimo was Gangland's first big leader. Step by step he worked his way up, beginning by carrying water for a section gang. Then he became a street sweeper, and it was in this capacity that his career really began. When under the supervision of Michael Hinky Dink Keena and Bathhouse John Coughlin, alderman in the ward in which he worked, he organized his fellow White Wings into a social and athletic club, which came to vote as a unit on election day. In recognition of his work, the alderman saw to it that Colosimo became precinct captain. From here he followed a more or less natural course, becoming a pool room proprietor, saloon keeper, dive keeper, and at last a ward boss and proprietor of Colosimo's Cafe. With his affluence, however, there did not come peace of mind. He began to receive letters from the mafia, at first threatening kidnapping for ransom, and later torture and death. He knew submission to the present demands for money would be nothing short of an invitation for future demands of increasingly larger amounts. He did not want to pay the money, and he certainly had no intention of submitting to their tortures. Instead, he went to New York City and the notorious 5 Points gang in search of a bodyguard. When he returned to Chicago, he was accompanied by Johnny Toro. Big Jim had been back in Chicago only a few days when 3 blackmailers came to his cafe, saying that, unless he appeared at a certain place the following day with $25,000, he would be killed. Colosimo consulted his recently acquired right-hand man, who advised him to agree to meet the blackmailers as they requested. At the appointed hour, Colosimo remained snugly at home, and in his place 4 men with sawed-off shotguns met the would-be extortionist. Big Jim received no more threats. That is, not until this one came from little Jimmy. In the meantime, the war had come and prohibition. The ambitious Torrio was quick to recognize a money-making opportunity. Something more than instinct told him that mankind would never deprive itself of its bottled spirits, and he set about gunning his way to gain power throughout Chicago and its environs. He must eliminate competition. There might be consolidations, but independent rivals? Never. Immediately after the telephone call from little Jimmy, Colosimo and Torrio went into conference. "How would you like to have a good man to help you muscle in?" queried Big Jim. "I need one," Torrio replied, and named his man. It was not long until Colosimo made another trip to New York and the 5 Points. He returned to Chicago He returned to Chicago not with 1 man, but with 2. Frankie Yale, nee Francisco Yueli, was chosen to take care of the little Jimmy Cosmano affair. But little Jimmy was too tough for Frankie's bullets. He went to the hospital instead of the morgue. Yale returned to New York, but the second man, the man of Torrio's choice, Al, the Scarface, remained in Chicago. Chapter 2. Al Capone quit school at the 4th grade to help support his family. He began by snatching food from vegetable carts and looting trucks and warehouses. Early, he acquired the reputation of being a good fighter and a quick thinker. Then, he had joined the Five Pointers and, before he left New York, had been questioned in 2 murder cases involving his gang. But he had only been questioned. Alfonso Capone, 23, alert and belligerent, had been watched by Torrio from the time his affiliations with the Five Points gang began. Torrio knew what he was about when he chose Al Capone. All the lad needed was a little polish. Torrio began to teach his wild young helper the social niceties, how to flash a winning smile, to shake hands, to hide his impulses behind a poker face. Capone was an apt pupil, and now rose to the status of a businessman. His card read, Alphonse Capone, second-hand furniture dealer, 2220 South Wabash Avenue. A perfect alibi, that business. And just a bit more than a front, too. There was real second-hand furniture, accessible to the Four Deuces, the real scene of Al Capone's Chicago debut. The place took its name from its address, 2222 South Wabash Avenue. It was a 4-story red brick building, extremely unimposing. No, externally unimposing, but internally, to say the least, much out of the ordinary. The first floor contained Torrio's offices, a saloon, and a cafe. The second and third floors were devoted to gambling, and the fourth to women. It was Gangland's general headquarters. This was in 1920. Then Big Jim was found dead in the hall leading to his cafe at the Four Deuces. It was in the morning hours when only a few of the employees were about. The killing remained unsolved. Pardon me. Big Jim's funeral was a magnificent affair, attended by prominent politicians, state legislators, judges, and city and county officials. Torrio was a pallbearer. So were Anthony DeAndre and Diamond Joe Esposito, Democratic and Republican committeemen from the old 19th Ward, who later died from bullets fired from sawed-off shotguns. Torrio and Capone had a clear field now. Chapter 3. During the next 2 years, Capone's work was quiet enough, but insidious. His name hadn't become a national byword. Police reporters didn't even know how to spell it correctly, and he certainly couldn't make the first page on any daily news sheet. But the fix was in. He was arrested, 3 charges placed against him: assault, driving while intoxicated, and carrying concealed weapons. He was ordered to appear in court the following morning. Al must have overslept, and being a considerate chap, just didn't want to inconvenience the court by being late, for he didn't appear. In addition to learning the social graces, Capone was making contacts with men that were to last a lifetime. But what an uncertain lifetime. It wasn't a democratic bunch either. You had to rate in gangland before you were allowed to line up in front of the long mahogany bar in the Four Deuces. Master gangsters, these. Poor old Joe Howard didn't rate. The nearest he could get to the Four Deuces was Haney Jacobs' saloon, a half a block down the street. On the whole, Joe hadn't been a very successful crook, but he had pulled 2 hijacking jobs successfully in one night. Joe was proud of the job, and prouder of himself for having pulled it. He liked to talk about it. Joe liked to talk anyway. Maybe that was the reason he hadn't gone so far. One fine spring evening, Joe was in Haney's place waxing voluble over his 3 fingers of bourbon. 2 working men, George Bilton and David Rummelsbeck, who had stopped for a mug of beer, and old Haney were his audience. Joe was sparing none of the details when two men walked in and headed straight for old Joe. He held out his hand, a cordial smile on his face, saying hello, Al. He had gained recognition from the big shots at last. But what recognition? The hand that met old Joe Howard's held a revolver. Joe was killed, the smile of welcome still on his face. Orders were issued for the arrest of Al Capone within a half hour after Joe Howard was murdered. But Capone was not to be found, and the next day at the inquest, Bilton, too, was missing. Haney had been called to the telephone just before the shooting occurred, and Rummelsbeck was stricken with a bad case of amnesia. A month later, Capone walked into the Cottage Grove police station and said, "I hear the police are looking for me. What for?" When old Joe Howard's death was mentioned, he declared he knew nothing whatsoever about it. He didn't live in the Four Deuces. He didn't know Torrio. He was a respectable businessman, a second-hand furniture dealer, out of town the day Joe Howard was killed. "You'd better talk to my lawyer," he finished. Assistant State's Attorney William H. McSwiggan, young and eager, tried to push the case, but the investigation ended in July with a verdict that Joe Howard was murdered by one or more unknown white male persons. Chapter 4. Spike O'Donnell, leader of the South Side O'Donnells, was serving time in Joliet when the bootlegging business was born. But his political pull was sufficient to get a parole before it was too late to rake in a little of the profit. Following his release, the South Side O'Donnells were no longer seen hanging over the bar at the Four Deuces. Their leader had come home. They had work to do. O'Connor, Meagan, and Butcher were drummers for O'Donnell before they were killed. Their method was simple, direct, and effective. The three of them would enter a saloon or blind pig, guns in evidence, and face the manager or proprietor. "Who you buying?" They knew the answer. There was a complete list with all the dope of every dealer in the territory. But they would wait for a reply, then say, "How about going along with us?" If the proprietor asked for time to consider, he was granted 24 hours, and if at the end of that time his mind wasn't favorable toward the O'Donnells, a beating was administered. This method rarely proved ineffectual. In stubborn cases, the dose was repeated until the dealer either quit or became an O'Donnell customer. One night, after making 5 calls and administering as many beatings, the drummers retired to 5358 South Lincoln Street to meet Spike and talk things over. They were all grouped about one end of the bar when 4 men, led by Deputy Sheriff McFall, unceremoniously entered the place and ordered, "Hands up." The South Side gang scattered, just as a 5th man, short and stocky and with hat pulled low, entered, carrying a sawed-off shotgun. McFall signaled the gun-toter to back out. In the street battle that followed, Jerry O'Connor was shot in the heart. McFall was indicted and tried for the killing, but he was acquitted. Meagan and Butcher lived 10 days longer. They had stopped to obey a traffic signal at Laughlin Street and Garfield Boulevard. A green touring car pulled up alongside them, pouring a stream of revolver bullets and shotgun slugs into them. Exit McGeegan and Butcher. Capone, when questioned, reiterated his business alibi. The O'Donnells were brought in to face him, but they gravely shook their heads. True to the code, Torrio disappeared, and with the collapse of the O'Connor case, the charges were dropped against those held for the Meagan-Butcher murders. Spike O'Donnell didn't admit defeat, however, until Morris Keeney, a beer runner, was shot on a lonely road, until Philip Corrigan was picked off his beer truck, and Henry C. Hassmiller, a gunman, together with Spike's brother, were shot in a roadhouse in Evergreen Park. Chapter 5. The real drama of Capone's descent upon Cicero lies in its subtlety. Ed Convalinka, the Republican committeeman, planned a ticket, gained an audience with Capone, and declared that if Al would help him get the votes, he, Capone, would be given a free hand in Cicero. An agreement was struck, and Cicero was given an election day, the like of which it had never seen before. Gangsters, cars sped through the streets, and guns roared and spat. The citizens were terrified. In one of the battles, Frank Capone, Al's brother, was killed. Evidently the right guys turned out to vote, though, for Al was established in Cicero overnight. General headquarters, the Hawthorne Hotel. Bars ran wide open. The handbook play averaged $50,000 a day. Stakes placed on the roulette wheels in the rear of louderbacks sometimes amounted to as much as $10,000 at one time. 500 prostitutes under Torrio's command sojourned in Stickney, the adjoining community. Of course, there were raids followed by close-ups and fines, but the same saloon, cafe, gambling den, or brothel reopened almost at once at a new address under a new name. Within 4 months, Capone and Torrio were clearing $75,000 a week. Eddie Tansey was the only opposition with which Capone met in Cicero, but he didn't last long. He was shot to death with his waiter, Leo Kilmes. Miles O'Donnell and James J. Dodderly, supposedly responsible, were prosecuted by McSwiggan and acquitted. Again, things sailed along pacifically with the Capone-Torrio business. Capone allowed other gangsters to join his forces, and as long as they played square with him, or didn't get too ambitious, their share was delivered on the dot. But when they too crossed him, sometimes when they only thought of two crossing him, they were put on the spot and without warning were drilled from behind. Chapter 6. Dion O'Banion rolled Chicago's north side, and Capone and Torrio rolled its south and west. The Big Three. Torrio planned and completed this triangular alliance just before the election that turned Cicero over to Capone. Dion controlled the Gold Coast vote through his power in the adjacent neighborhood, far different than the neighborhood just a few blocks away, where the swanky cooperative apartment houses stand. O'Banion's share in Cicero was to be a liquor concession and a third interest in the $50,000 a day handbook. The liquor concession revealed an opportunity for large profits, and Dion, accustomed to taking what he wanted when he wanted it, eased in about 50 saloon keepers. Under the original alliance, about $20,000 a month had been agreed upon as his fair share, but at the end of 4 months he was netting over $100,000. This, of course, was very irritating to Capone and Torrio when they found it out, especially since Dion had maintained absolute silence in regard to his profits. Hostility was brewing. In an effort to avoid anything drastic, Torrio hurried to O'Bannon with a new proposal. If you'll stick to the fourth split on beer revenues, we'll cut you in on the combines, brothels, and Stickney, offered Torrio. O'Banion laughed. "Go peddle your papers, Johnny," he said. Dion would have nothing to do with the trafficking in women, and he never touched booze. O'Banion was a florist during daylight working hours, one of the best. He was sensitive to color values and clever at arranging the flowers. As he puttered about, rearranging a bowl of roses here, plucking a dead leaf there, or clipping a stem with hands small and delicate, he looked to be anything but a bloodthirsty assassin. Yet he was known as Chicago's only three-gun man, the worst of the lot. It was just after the election, in which Dion had been quite successful in electing the candidates of his choice, that Mike Merlo, founder of the Union Skillione, and its first president, died a natural death. The only president of the Alky Cooking Guild who did. But Mike deserved a swell funeral anyway. Vacco, whom Merlot had put in office, and James Genna, one of the 6 shooting Gennas, who was on the alky cooking for the combine, entered O'Banion's shop and gave him an order for $750 worth of flowers, telling him to stay in the shop. It was nearly noon, because some other friends of Mike's were coming for flowers. They came. A blue Jewett sedan pulled up at the curb opposite Dion O'Banion's flower shop. 3 men alighted. The 4th stayed at the wheel while the engine purred rhythmically. The 3 men entered the shop. They walked abreast and were greeted by the smiling Dion, who had been in the back of the shop clipping the stems of a bunch of chrysanthemums. In his left hand he carried his florist's shears. His right extended for a friendly handclasp. "Hello, boys. You from Mike Merlot's?" The porter at work in the back of the shop heard him say, and as the swinging door through which Dion had just passed swung shut, he saw the center man grasp the hand so cordially extended by Dion. But the greeting he heard return was 5 shots fired in rapid succession, a slight pause, and the 6th bullet added its finishing touch. The 3 men hurried from the shop, entered the sedan, and were whirled away. Officials questioned Torrio, Capone, and the Gennas, and Semi, Scalisi, and Frankie Yell of New York were suspected, but nothing ever came of it. They all had their alibis, and as usual, there was the wall of silence. Torrio and Capone attended Dion's funeral and sat directly opposite Bugs Moran. Jaime Weiss and Shemmer Druce, O'Banion's henchmen, the 5 rode in the same car to the cemetery, faced each other across the grave. After the funeral, Torrio fled from Chicago, the O'Banions hot on his trail, following him until he returned, and they finally overtook him in front of his house. "I know who they are," Torrio said later in Jackson Park Hospital. "It's my business." An investigation was attempted, but Torrio refused to aid in its prosecution. Instead, he vanished. And I think we'll stop there for the end of the first part of The Amazing Career of Al Capone, Little Blue Book number 1723, written by Leah Gregg. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in part 2.